An intensive care unit nurse from the Veterans Hospital has been executed by Federal Border Patrol agents while documenting ICE operations with his cell phone. His name was Alex J. Prey, 37 years old, no criminal record, legal firearm carrier with a concealed carry permit. He received between 10 and 11 gunshots while on the ground, after being beaten, clubbed, and pepper sprayed. What we have just witnessed is not an isolated case of excessive use of force. It is the clearest manifestation so far of a systemic transformation. The United States has crossed the line into the territory of operational totalitarianism. When a state begins to fabricate lies about the people it murders, when it constructs false narratives to justify extrajudicial executions, when it turns innocent victims into imaginary villains, that state has crossed into the territory of pure totalitarianism. And that is exactly what we have just witnessed in the last few hours. The documented facts completely destroy the governmental narrative they are now trying to build from Washington. Alex worked as an ICU nurse at the Veterans Hospital, caring for the very men and women this regime claims to honor when it's politically convenient. His colleagues describe him as a good and kind person who lived to help others. We're not talking about a criminal. We're not talking about someone with a history of violence. We're talking about a healthcare professional who dedicated his life to caring for American veterans. Dr. Dmitry Jacona, who worked with Alex, published a heartbreaking tribute that we should all read and remember. He said Alex was his colleague at the Veterans Hospital, that they had hired him to recruit for a clinical trial that eventually became an intensive care nurse position. He loved working with him. He was a good and kind person, and these bastards executed him. He described how they used to chat between patients about trying to go mountain biking together. Now, they never can because Alex is dead, murdered by the state. These are the words of a colleague, of someone who knew Alex, who worked with him every day, who saw his humanity, his kindness, his dedication. And that man was executed in the streets of an American city. Let me tell you exactly what happened in those final moments of Alex Prey's life, based on eyewitness testimonies and the videos that have circulated in the last few hours. Alex was on the streets of Minneapolis, documenting with his cell phone the actions of ICE and Border Patrol as they terrorized communities. He was exercising a fundamental right in any democracy, the right to document government actions. He had a firearm with a legal concealed carry permit. Something that is completely legal in Minnesota and something that Republicans supposedly defend fanatically as a sacred constitutional right. Border Patrol agents approached him, beat him, brutally clubbed him. They used their weapons as batons against his body. They threw him to the ground. While he was on the ground, they apparently pepper sprayed him directly in his face. They beat him repeatedly while he was defenseless and then shot him between 10 and 11 times against a man who was on the ground. A man whose hands, according to circulating videos, appeared to be empty or holding a cell phone. 11 shots. Think about that. 11 shots against a man on the ground. Alex J. Prey, say his name. Because this regime wants us to forget. It wants these deaths to become faceless statistics. Numbers in a report, closed cases without real investigation. It wants us to accept that the state can kill with impunity and then fabricate whatever justification it needs to cover its crimes. And speaking of fabricating justifications, let's see exactly how the Trump regime responded to this murder in record time. Stephen Miller, the architect of the cruelest immigration policies in modern American history, the man who should be on trial in The Hague for crimes against humanity, posted the following about Alex Prey. He said, and I quote verbatim, "A domestic terrorist attempted to murder federal agents, and this is your response. You and the entire Democratic state leadership team have been fanning the flames of insurrection with the sole purpose of stopping the deportation of illegals who invaded the country." Let me be absolutely clear about what Stephen Miller just did here. He called an intensive care nurse who cared for veterans, a man with no criminal record, an American citizen exercising his constitutional right both to bear arms and to document government actions. He called him a domestic terrorist. And he did it knowing it was a lie. He did it knowing Alex was holding a cell phone. He did it knowing Alex had legal permits for his firearm. He did it knowing there is absolutely no evidence that Alex attempted to attack anyone. He did it because the truth doesn't matter in a fascist regime. Only the narrative that justifies state violence matters. Only creating the illusion of threat to justify murder matters. As Ron Filipkovsky, our editor-in-chief, pointed out, filming federal agents is only domestic terrorism to fascists. That phrase perfectly captures the mentality of this regime. In a functional democracy, citizens have the absolute right to document government actions. In fact, it's one of the most important checks against abuse of power. It's the reason why the civil rights movement in the United States could show the world the brutality they faced. It's the reason why cases like George Floyd's came to public consciousness. But in a police state, Documenting the government's crimes makes you an enemy of the state. And enemies of the state can be executed without trial, without process, without justice. But Stephen Miller wasn't the only one to defame a dead man. Donald Trump, the President of the United States of America, posted a series of statements so vile, so full of lies and psychological manipulation, that they should make any decent person feel physical revulsion. Trump posted a photo of Alex's weapon with 2 additional magazines and wrote, "This is the gunman's weapon, loaded with 2 full additional magazines and ready to go." Where is the local police? Why weren't they allowed to protect ICE officers? The mayor and governor held them back. Let's analyze this statement layer by layer, because every sentence is a lie or a deliberate distortion of the facts. First, calling Alex Prey the gunman when he had a legal permit to carry firearms is a deliberate manipulation of language, designed to create an image in the public's mind. Gunman evokes images of criminals, of mass shooters, of violent threats. But Alex was none of that. He was a legal gun carrier exercising a right that the Constitution supposedly protects. Second, showing that he had additional magazines as evidence of malicious intentions is completely absurd when millions of Americans carry additional ammunition legally every day. Going to the shooting range, going to practice, simply exercising your right to be prepared. All of this is legal and common. Third, and perhaps most insidious, the claim that local police were held back from protecting ICE is a complete inversion of reality. The truth is exactly the opposite. The truth is that ICE prevented Minneapolis police from securing the crime scene. Police Chief Brian O'Hara explicitly refused to obey ICE's orders to stand down because he understood that they were trying to cover up a homicide. That takes courage. It takes integrity. And it's exactly the opposite of what Trump is saying. But Trump didn't stop there. He never stops when he can go deeper into conspiracy and distraction. He continued with a completely reality-disconnected conspiratorial rant, saying, "Why does Ilhan Omar have $34 million in her account? And where are the tens of thousands of billions of dollars that have been stolen from the once great state of Minnesota? We are there due to massive monetary fraud, with billions of dollars missing, and illegal criminals who were allowed to infiltrate the state through the Democrats' open borders policy. We want the money back, and we want it now." See what he's doing here? A man has just been murdered by federal agents under his command, and Trump is trying to change the subject to unfounded conspiracy theories about stolen money and massive fraud. He's throwing wild accusations without evidence against a congresswoman. He's inventing narratives of corruption involving billions of dollars. He's creating phantom enemies and imaginary threats. This is classic authoritarian regime propaganda. When you can't defend your actions, when the facts condemn you, you create distractions. You accuse your opponents of imaginary crimes, you fabricate internal enemies and hope that people are so confused, so overwhelmed by all the accusations and counter-accusations, that they lose sight of the central fact. Your government just executed an innocent citizen in broad daylight. Trump then has the absolute audacity to write, "Much of what you are witnessing is a cover-up of this theft and fraud." The mayor and governor are inciting insurrection with their pompous, dangerous, and arrogant rhetoric. Stop for a moment and process this. A president of the United States is calling it insurrection when democratically elected state officials try to investigate a homicide committed by federal agents. The irony is so thick, so obscene, you could cut it with a knife. This is the same man who incited a literal attack against the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021. The same man whose words sent a violent mob to attack the center of American government. The same man who tried to stop the certification of a democratic election. But now he says that a governor asking for accountability for a murder, asking that basic investigation protocols be followed, is insurrection. Language has lost all meaning. Words are weapons this regime uses to justify anything. Trump's statement concludes with, 12,000 illegal foreign criminals, many of them violent, have been arrested and removed from Minnesota. If they were still there, you would see something much worse than what you are witnessing today. This is perhaps the most revealing part of his entire rant. Trump is implicitly admitting that what we are witnessing is horrible. He's acknowledging that what people see on the streets of Minneapolis is terrible. But he's saying it's necessary, that it's a necessary evil, that without this violence, without these mass raids, without this terror, something worse would happen. This is the logic of every authoritarian regime in history. The fascists in Italy said it was necessary to prevent communism. The Nazis in Germany said it was necessary to protect racial purity. The dictators in Latin America said it was necessary to prevent subversion. And now Trump says it's necessary to prevent the invasion of foreign criminals. There's always an existential threat. There's always an enemy at the gates. And always, always, state violence is presented as the only solution. But the reality, as documented by videos circulating on social media and testimonies from terrorized residents, is that ICE and Border Patrol entered peaceful communities in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and surrounding cities and turned them into war zones. They gassed residents with green carcinogenic gas floating in the air. They indiscriminately threw pepper spray at families. They threw flash grenades in residential neighborhoods. They repeatedly shot people in their faces with less lethal ammunition that can cause permanent damage. They ripped 5-year-old children from their families, small children wearing blue bunny hats, crying as they were separated from their parents. They kidnapped 2-year-old children, 2 years old. Think about that. This is a terrorist regime operating on American soil, and Trump's attempt to present this as necessary normal law enforcement operations is obscene. It's an offense to the intelligence of anyone who can see what is happening. Greg Bavino, who runs Border Patrol under this regime, held a press conference where he continued the smear campaign against Alex Prey. He said verbatim, "This appears to be a situation where the individual wanted to cause maximum harm and massacre law enforcement. We stopped a massacre. This is a lie fabricated completely from nothing. Alex had a cell phone in his hands. He was documenting federal operations. He had a legally permitted weapon that was apparently in its holster and never drawn. There is no evidence whatsoever, no video, no testimony, showing that Alex tried to shoot anyone." But Bavino needs that narrative, because without it, what happened is simply and clearly a murder by the state. Without that narrative of imminent threat, of attempted massacre, of extreme danger, what remains is the naked truth. Federal agents beat, gassed, and executed an innocent citizen who was exercising his constitutional rights. Contrast that press conference full of lies with that of Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota. Walz spoke about Alex as what he was, a real human being. A 37-year-old Minnesota resident, a legal firearm carrier with a concealed carry permit, something that, as Walz noted with clear irony, Republicans have preached for decades is not only a constitutional right, but a civic duty. Walz said, "We all understand what happened this morning and the tragedy, and my deepest condolences to the family of a 37-year-old Minnesota resident, a legal firearm carrier with a concealed permit, something I have been lectured about by Republicans for decades. Not only is it right, it's your duty." That last line cuts like a razor. Republicans have built an entire political industry around the right to bear arms. They have said over and over again that citizens need to be armed to protect themselves from tyrannical government. But when a citizen exercises that right and ends up dead at the hands of the government, he suddenly becomes a domestic terrorist. Walz continued by making a crucial distinction between how Minnesota wants to handle this crisis versus how the Trump regime is handling it. He said, "We all understand that the potential to further inflame tensions is high. And for Minnesotans, there is a clear difference. We want calm, peace, and normalcy back in our lives. They want chaos. We cannot and will not give them what they want by responding to violence with violence." That statement is profoundly important from a geopolitical and strategic perspective. Walz is openly acknowledging that the Trump regime wants to provoke a violent response. They want the people of Minnesota to respond with uncontrolled rage and violence, because that would give them the perfect justification for even more severe repression, to declare martial law, to send more federal troops, to suspend more rights. That's the classic trap of authoritarianism. Provoke the population until they respond violently, and then use that violence as justification to crush all dissent. Walz is telling the people of Minnesota not to fall into that trap, to maintain peaceful protests, to document absolutely everything, to build a massive and irrefutable evidence record. Because that evidence will eventually be used to prosecute those responsible when this regime falls or is removed from power. In fact, Walz said something explicitly unprecedented. Minnesotans are bearing witness, and we are creating an evidence record for the future prosecution of ICE agents and officials responsible for this that is absolutely remarkable coming from a state governor. It's a public declaration that this state, Minnesota, is actively maintaining detailed records of what it considers federal crimes, with the explicit intent of eventually prosecuting federal agents and Trump regime officials. That is institutional resistance in its clearest and most organized form. It's not symbolic resistance. It's not empty rhetoric. It's a concrete legal strategy of documentation for future trials. Walz also expressed justified incredulity at the conduct of federal forces after the shooting. He said, "They killed a man, created chaos, pushed protesters through gas indiscriminately in residential neighborhoods, and then simply abandon the scene and leave us to clean up their mess. There is only one case in the history and say, I guess that just happened, and we're not going to clean up our mess. We're not going to follow protocols. That rhetorical question perfectly captures the absurdity and clear illegality of what happened. In any shooting involving law enforcement in the United States, there are strict protocols established by decades of jurisprudence and practice. The scene must be secured immediately. Evidence must be meticulously preserved. There must be an independent investigation conducted by separate agencies to avoid conflicts of interest. But ICE and Border Patrol just left. They abandoned the scene of a homicide, as if nothing had happened. And when local authorities tried to do their job, tried to follow those basic protocols, they were actively blocked by the Department of Homeland Security. In fact, the Department of Homeland Security took complete control of the investigation and made the extraordinary decision to pull the FBI away from the scene. They are actively trying to block the FBI, Minnesota state officials, Minneapolis local officials from conducting any kind of independent investigation. Why would they do that if they have absolutely nothing to hide? The answer is obvious to anyone with eyes to see. They are covering up a murder. They are destroying evidence. They are controlling the narrative. They are making sure that only their version of events is what reaches the public. The contrast between the regime's official narrative and the reality documented on video couldn't be clearer or more damning. ICE and Border Patrol issued official statements saying, Border Patrol agents are extremely well trained to protect themselves, their fellow agents, and innocent third parties. When an alleged peaceful protester brings a weapon like a loaded pistol and brandishes it threateningly, there will be serious consequences and repercussions. What they're saying with that official statement is this: if you, as an American citizen, have a legal permit to carry firearms, if you have concealed carry in a state that constitutionally allows it, if you exercise that right while also exercising your right to document government actions, ICE and Border Patrol consider you a threat that can be eliminated. They will shoot you, execute you in the street, and this police state that is the Trump regime will justify that murder after the fact, no matter what the evidence says. The Department of Homeland Security published a completely fabricated official statement. They said, at 9:05 a.m. Central Time, while DHS law enforcement officers were conducting a targeted operation in Minneapolis against an illegal alien wanted for violent assault, an individual aggressively approached us. Border Patrol officers with a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Officers repeatedly attempted to disarm the suspect, but the armed suspect violently resisted and posed an imminent threat. We know from the videos that have circulated that this is 100% lies. The same way they lied about Renee Nicole Good when she was murdered. The same way they systematically defamed the terrorized parents of the young children Chloe and Liam, whom they kidnapped on camera. This is what this authoritarian fascist regime does every damn day. It lies, it fabricates, it distorts, it inverts reality. Even the regime's state media, the propaganda chain that calls itself Fox News, was running at full capacity with its manipulation machinery. They repeated over and over again in a hypnotic loop, this is what we voted for. This is what the American people wanted. This is making America great again. As if the American people had specifically voted for ICU nurses who care for veterans to be executed in the streets for documenting government actions. As if anyone, anywhere had voted for 2-year-old children to be gassed with carcinogenic chemicals in their own neighborhoods. And here is perhaps the most flagrant and revealing hypocrisy of all. Kristi Noem, who now heads the Department of Homeland Security under Trump, gave an impassioned speech at the National Rifle Association convention in 2023. In that speech, just 2 years ago, she spoke fervently about the Second Amendment. She said the Second Amendment is fundamentally about deterrence, about ensuring that the government respects citizens' rights and freedom, about maintaining a balance of power. She directly quoted the Constitution, a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. But apparently, according to this regime that she now helps lead, those constitutional rights only apply to certain types of people. If you're a far-right protester armed to the teeth at the Capitol on January 6th, it's perfectly fine. If you're an ICU nurse documenting government abuses with a legal carry permit, you're a domestic terrorist who deserves to be executed with 11 shots. Governor Gavin Newsom of California captured the absolute gravity of this historical moment in a simple but devastatingly powerful post. He said, "You are seeing with your own eyes what is happening in American streets. This is a police state. Speak up, show up, use your rights peacefully before it's too late." That is exactly right, and any honest person must admit it. This is a police state operating in broad daylight. And the existential question for every American, for every person who considers themselves a citizen of a democracy now is, what are you going to do about it? Because if we normalize this, if we passively accept that the government can execute citizens in the streets and then fabricate convenient justifications after the fact, then we no longer live in a functional republic. We no longer live in a democracy with rule of law. We live in a dictatorship with theatrical elections, with hollow institutions, with rights that only exist on paper. The geopolitical scenarios moving forward are clear and deeply concerning. First, there can be continuous and unstoppable escalation. More citizen murders. More institutional cover-ups. More systematic repression of dissent. That path inevitably leads to massive, violent confrontation that no one can predict how it will end or how much blood will be spilled. Second, there can be a social breaking point where enough Americans say enough, where protests grow exponentially so much that the regime can't contain them, even with all its repressive machinery, where state and local officials massively refuse to cooperate with federal orders they consider illegal. Third, there can be deep institutional fragmentation where different parts of the federal government turn against each other, where states refuse to recognize federal authority, creating a constitutional crisis unprecedented since the Civil War. Fourth, and perhaps the most terrifying scenario of all, there can be gradual normalization where this simply becomes how things are now, where people get used to state terror, where extrajudicial executions become part of daily life. Alex J. Prey deserved to live. He deserved to return every day to his job caring for veterans who gave so much for their country. He deserved to fulfill those simple and beautiful plans of going mountain biking with his colleagues. He deserved to grow old, start a family, see the future. His family deserves real justice, not empty words. And all of us deserve to live in a country where the state cannot murder you simply for exercising your most basic constitutional rights. History is watching us in this crucial moment, and each one of us will be judged, will be remembered for what we did or didn't do when fascism openly came to American streets. We cannot say we didn't know. We cannot use that cowardly excuse. The evidence is literally everywhere, on our screens, in our streets. The videos are circulating. The testimonies are documented. The regime's lies are exposed. Everything is being recorded for history. The question that defines our time is whether we will have the moral courage to resist before it's too late, before the point of no return is crossed.